Hello everyone, welcome to the Whiteboard. I wanted to take a second and talk about a piece of malware called XcodeSpy. Now this came out, there's a beautiful article that came out that I have linked below that was done by SentinalOne that was talking about a in-the-wild project that they found where someone had infected a GitHub project that utilized Xcode, which is a developer's environment for the macOS. If you're not familiar with it, you probably don't use it, so you probably don't need to worry about it, and that's kind of one of the focuses I'm going to have here, because I'm not going to regurgitate the article. It is a very well done article, and I've linked it and a few other articles that talk about XcodeSpy and some of the activity that is linked to it down below in the description. Take a second to look at those. Now, why did I bring this up then if I'm not going to talk in detail about XcodeSpy the malware? Because of a very interesting thing that happened after this article occurred. Several people that work in companies that I like and trust and work with, they read this article and they had a very legitimate but unfounded worry that their Mac devices, their iPhones, their iPads, their MacBooks, their laptops, everything might be infected potentially by this XcodeSpy malware. Even though the article that was presented by SentinalOne was really clear that this was focused on Xcode developers. And so I wanted to talk just about that for a second, because it's kind of important when you see this type of reporting to understand it in context. And you're going to hear me talk about two things on a regular basis. One of which is context. Everything should always be put in context. What does that mean? It means that you should situate whatever you're reading in the proper context of what has to occur for it to be in place or to happen. So if someone is talking about, in this case, XcodeSpy malware, there has to be someone with Xcode present on their device. It has to be there for this to even be an issue. Otherwise, XcodeSpy, the way it's set up in the article and depicted, cannot run. It requires you to execute a project utilizing Xcode. But I'll talk about that second point here in a minute. The first thing is you need to know that Xcode has to be present, which goes back to context. You need to know this in order to understand the context. And the second most important thing you need to know, and you're going to hear me say these things over and over, is you have to personalize it to your environment. So you have to understand the threat, in which case it right now is XcodeSpy, in the context and have it personalized for your environment. If this here is not a threat to you, these are the ways you're going to figure that out. And one of the things that you can figure out is in context is Xcode has to be present. Now, if your environment does not have Mac devices at all, this is not a concern for you. On your risk management breakdown, however you do it, your framework should support the fact that if this doesn't exist in your environment and it has no secondary or tertiary implications, you can check it out. Mark that off, done. However, if you do have Macs, be it iPhones, iPads, or other things that you have a concern about, you need to then understand the context, because you're now personalizing this threat to you. You're going to hear me talk about these a lot over the many videos we'll see. But back to this, XcodeSpy requires Xcode to be present. Now you may say, or may think that, well, Xcode should be present, right? It is a Mac developer's environment. Well, the answer to that is no. Depending on the version, you may not have any kind of Xcode present. In fact, if you have even any of the modern versions, it does not come in pre-installed. Now there are some exceptions to that rule, but in most cases when you buy your Mac and it shows up, the default software package does not have Xcode installed. In fact, statistics I was able to find for 2020 showed that less than 1% have Xcode installed of all the Mac users that they were able to poll. And they polled tens of thousands of Mac users and said, do you have Xcode installed? And the majority of them responded with this: what's Xcode? Because they utilize the Mac product, they don't utilize Xcode development environment. So right there, you are taking a small pool of people that utilize Macs and then getting an even smaller pool of folks that have Xcode installed. So if you have these in your environment and you're wondering if, as I personalize this threat to my environment, do I have the context for it to even execute? In most cases, the answer will be no. This will not affect you. You will make that determination yourself as you personalize all the details to understand if it could be an impact to you or not. So Xcode has to be there. And just in case this comes up, it's not going to sneakily, stealthily show up. Xcode can be downloaded a couple of ways. And yes, it is completely plausible that an attacker could get on your Mac, download Xcode, somehow install it for you without you knowing, and then be able to execute XcodeSpy, because then they would have to download Xcode and get it functional, download a project where XcodeSpy actually exists, compile or build that project so that it would actually execute and do what it talks about in the article written by the wonderful SentinalOne. If they're going to go through that much effort, they might as well just drop malware because they have that level of control already. Why would they go through this very convoluted path? There is a point of where it does not make sense. So please, I want to disabuse those scenarios up front. Yes, someone could plausibly take that route where they do this behind your back without you knowing, whether they did it in one session or multiple sessions, but the amount of effort there is not necessarily worth it, and it would be a fairly unique situation for that to occur. So again, not mainstream. In most cases, you know you have Xcode because you installed it or someone else did. And there's a series of checks to see if you have Xcode, very easy ones. The downside to those checks is they vary a lot by the type of operating system you have. So depending on what version of macOS you're running, or iOS, it could not work, whether you use the GCC compiler piece to check for it or you use something else by invoking Xcopy itself to see if it's present. It does not matter. I'm sorry, Xcode, not Xcopy. To invoke it to see if it's there or not. It doesn't matter. They may or may not work depending on the version, which is why I'm not going to go through the trouble of putting all that down there, because I'd have to literally fill out the 5,000 characters I'm allowed in the description with just the different ways for you to check. Look it up if you're worried. In most cases, you're going to install Xcode two ways. One, Apple iStore. So you can go to your store and look if you have it as a product that you've downloaded. And secondly, from the internet somewhere, in which case it will be visible in terminal or visible on your operating system, and you can navigate to it and look for it. What I can do is put a simple search down in the description for you to utilize, if that's helpful. If for some reason I forget, somebody put a comment, so I make sure to do that. But back to this. XcodeSpy requires Xcode. It also requires a project that has been compromised. I'll write this down. Compromised Xcode project. So you have to have at least two things here. Again, we're personalizing the threat, putting it in context. XcodeSpy, to have this happen, any part of it, it begins with you having Xcode installed, which will not happen by accident. It requires you to actually find an Xcode project, download that project, and then execute it. And then the exploit or the compromise, however you like to describe it, that's built in will start this XcodeSpy process that's outlined in the article. So let's talk about this. We were talking about populations a second ago. Less than 1% of the people out there have Xcode installed. As you can imagine, it's even a tinier population that actually utilize it. Additionally, I did some statistic work. I kind of looked up a couple numbers, so not statistics, just numbers. I went and looked and I said, how many Xcode projects would there be on GitHub? So as of today, I looked and there's 27,000 Xcode projects that I could find with an easy search. By the time you look, there might be more, there might be less. As you can imagine, they both plus and subtract. So that's 27,000. Let's put that in context. I looked for Python projects on GitHub. I got 2 million. I looked for Ruby projects. I got 300,000. I looked for Lua projects. I got 180K. By no means is Xcode projects common. So, for folks that are worried about this being potentially there to infect them, it is a small use case that is fairly focused on Xcode developers, which are a very, very tiny population. So if you're looking at your risk matrix on whether you need to worry about XcodeSpy because you have Mac products in your environment, the answer is likely no. You can do a couple checks and personalize the threat to your environment, and then do those checks in context, like, is Xcode in my environment? That's something you can look for. EDR products, any network scanning products can do a quick check on what's installed and tell you what's there or not. Know that it's a very small population that is utilizing it. Identify those and check for it. And along the way, as you're doing your threat hunting anyway, make sure nobody else has something installed they shouldn't. Common things that you should do anyway on a regular basis as part of your security program. And know that it's a small piece. Now, the other part that I want to touch on with XcodeSpy was in the article, SentinalOne also made an implication that there was a connection between XcodeSpy and the activity that's being currently focused on security researchers and folks in the security industry by an unknown attacker. There's some attribution pointing at different countries, but pardon my skepticism. I'll just leave it at that. You can read for yourself and make your own conclusions based on the evidence presented and the conclusions and speculation presented on all sides, for and against, whether that's a true statement or not. But if this is connected, and it possibly could be, then it further refines the idea that attackers have definitely pivoted and have learned that not only should they look at the supply chain, but they should look not only at those elements of support that are company-based, but also individual. Why focus just on the company that provides a supporting mechanism for my target? Why not focus on the people that provide the research and analysis for that company? Whether they're part of them or they're part of a support, it does not matter to them. That's what this kind of attack is aimed at, a part of the supply chain that isn't ordinarily looked for. You're not going to find a magic product, a magic tree, yellow brick road, or anything else out there that has a wonderkin answer for whether XcodeSpy could have affected a person who's an analyst or an engineer that's doing support activity. It doesn't exist. You can only find that out through analysis. So, again, small population, and even if that is a true statement about there being a connection to that ongoing campaign that started in January 2020 and is continuing, that focuses on security researchers and people involved in the security industry, and if this is a part of it, it's only one aspect. And it may not be performed by the same people who are performing the fake LinkedIn personas, the fake companies, the attempts to get people to go to videos like this one or other ones like it that have things in it that are tells, that send you someplace that try to get you to download a file, compile a project, or do anything like that that could potentially get you infected. The only way they succeed is by misinformation or by getting you to take an action you should not, such as them giving you a token and having you put that token in somewhere, or providing credentials or some other form of activity. Everything should be met with proper skepticism. It will save you lots of trouble regardless of what the attack is. But to stay on topic, XcodeSpy. I put it forth as an example of, one, SentinalOne doing a great write-up, because they do, but two, that if you put this in context and personalize it to your environment, you can answer very rapidly on a risk scale whether this should be something you should concern yourself about, or whether it can go very far down in the things you need to worry about because it is not relevant. If you don't know how to do this, give me a comment, send me a message or whatever, and I'll add this to the upcoming videos if there's interest on how to put together a simplified risk matrix to handle things like this, because this should be part of your intelligence program. Whatever you call it, threat intelligence, cyber intelligence, whatever, you need to understand how to perform this activity. Not something suited necessarily for an apprentice, but definitely things that a junior, senior, and principal would be involved in and would assist, if not outright do in some cases, to help leadership understand which way one to pivot to threats and which threats to even worry about in the first place. So, again, a short whiteboard discussion. Thank you for your time. If you like this video, spend a second and press the like button. If you like this a lot or enough, and you're impressed enough that you like it and other content, please subscribe so that you can see new and other whiteboard discussions and lectures as they happen. Thank you for your time.